All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Services for Independent Living's Older Adults and Aging Having Dementia While Being Socially Isolated webinar. Today's webinar has been brought to you by Services for Independent Living and Benjamin Rose Institute on Aging. My name is India Jones. I am the Community Services Manager here at Services for Independent Living, and I will be your webinar facilitator for today. Just want to go over a few housekeeping rules. All participants will be muted during the webinar. Please put any questions that you have in the questions box. We will attempt to answer them at the end of the webinar. A recording will be available on our website at www.sil-oh.org. There will be a satisfaction survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar. Please fill it out. This is how we get our feedback on how we are doing, and I also get to hear about any other topics that you may be interested in learning about. If you would like to receive 1 CEU credit for attendance, and this is only offered to licensed social workers, licensed independent social workers, and social work assistants, please select yes on that particular question on the survey that will pop up directly after this webinar. A copy of today's PowerPoint will be presented, that will be being presented today is available for download in the handout section. So please feel free to download it if you would like. Now today's speaker is someone who is really well versed on this topic. Her name is Lisa Weitzman. She is a dementia care specialist and WeCare manager of business development over at Benjamin Rose Institute on Aging. And we are very happy to have her today. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Lisa. Lisa, you have the floor.
Great, thank you so much and welcome everybody. So glad that you could join. So today we're going to talk about something that's really become a buzz. And I say that because so many people are starting to talk about it and ask about it. And that's around the conversation of someone I know is socially isolated, living alone, and has dementia. Is this really possible? So we will delve into this and look forward to the conversation afterwards. Next slide, please. So just a quick review of what are our goals for today. The first thing I want to do is just level set the conversation and make sure that we're all operating from the same definition. So what is dementia? What is living alone? How do we define that? And how is living alone different from social isolation? Then we'll examine the intersection of dementia and living alone. What are the ways that we can help older adults with dementia to maintain their independence? And look at that both from a community-based solution and from an individual-focused solution. Next slide, please. So to begin with, let's talk about what this challenge or problem looks like. Estimates today indicate that 13.8 million older adults live alone. Approximately 1/3 of people with dementia and 1 in 7 of those with Alzheimer's also live alone. But interestingly, and part of the challenge is that only 40% of those people living alone with the diagnosis have an actual diagnosis. 50% of them have no identifiable caregiver. And as a result, and probably as really a part of this whole problem, is that they experience far more hospital stays and their outpatient costs are much higher than for older adults with dementia who have some type of support network or identified caregiver as a part of their solution. Next slide, please. So what is dementia? I think the first thing to recognize is that dementia is actually an overall term that describes a wide range of symptoms having to do with memory loss. So oftentimes people will say, well, how do I know if it's just a sign of aging? Is dementia normal to aging? And the reality is that dementia is not a normal part of aging. We all can become forgetful. We all might forget where we've left our keys or to bring our cell phone along with us. But dementia is really when those memory loss and those thinking skills are impacted in a way that it impacts our ability to perform everyday activities and disrupts our daily life. Not only is dementia a disease that impacts memory, but it also affects judgment, reasoning, thinking, and organizational skills. In fact, all those skills that really impact our ability to live independently. And just to make it clear, there are about 80 types of dementia, each of which affect the brain in different ways, each of which result in different types of behaviors, but all of which make it hard for a person to live alone in the community. Next slide, please. It's also important to remember as we think about dementia is that no two people experience dementia in exactly the same way. It is usually a slow-moving disease, but oftentimes people can be diagnosed much later on in the process than others, and therefore it might seem like it's moving faster than for somebody else. Initially, people might be able to live completely independently. Then they might need some type of support, then full-time support, and then sadly, towards the end of the disease process, 24-hour care. Next slide, please. But as I said, everybody is different. And the really difficult thing about understanding how far along somebody is or whether they even have dementia is that persons with dementia can have really good days when they function really well. And so for those of us around them and who care about them, or maybe even for them, our denial gets in the way. And we like to think, well, yes, you know, they really weren't functioning well for the last week, but today was such a good day, it couldn't possibly be dementia. And we're so afraid of the diagnosis, and understandably in many ways, that we don't really accept what it is and put the supports in place that people need in order to be able to live effectively in their own home. Moreover, people with dementia become really adept at masking their symptoms. There's something called cognitive reserve, which suggests that people who have higher processing skills and maybe have more education and whatnot actually can stave off the real signs and symptoms of dementia for much longer than for people who may not have that same educational level, because their brain has a reserve of cognition that they can draw upon. And what it means is that by the time we recognize that that person really has memory loss, they may be much further down the curve of the disease than others. And people also progress through the disease at very different rates, which can also be impacted by when they were diagnosed, are they taking medications to perhaps slow down the progression of the disease, what have you. Next slide, please. So as we think about the brain, and as we think about the progression of dementia, sometimes it's confusing because we'll say about people living with dementia, well, you know, she didn't really remember what she had to eat for lunch today, but oh my goodness, when we talk about what life was like in 1940, she does not miss a beat. And I think one way to think about it is to think about it in the context of these two bookshelves. If you look on the bookshelves on the right of the healthy brain, all of the shelves are filled with books. The top shelf, if we think about it, are the facts and the complex thinking that happens in our brain. And the bottom shelves are our emotions that we experience. So along with people, oftentimes we know that people lose their short-term memory before they lose their long-term memory. But it's also helpful to think about, where is that person in the midst of all of this? So as dementia progresses, you'll notice that those top shelves thin out pretty quickly, particularly compared to the bottom shelves. And that's our facts, our complex thinking, our ability to work with numbers, what have you. But the bottom shelves, in most part, stay pretty full. There are a few books missing from that shelf on the right-hand side, but there are not nearly as many as are missing on the top. And what this really shows us is that at the end of the day, the person living with dementia, the person we're trying to engage, is really the same person. They have those emotions. They can experience love. They can experience happiness. They can experience loss. And so as we think about how we meet their needs from a service perspective, it's important to recognize that the person is still really there. Next slide, please. So let's define living alone, because there's really 4 different ways of thinking about it. The most obvious way is the person who lives alone in their own home, perhaps by choice, perhaps by circumstance, but nonetheless, they are the only person in their house, all day, every day. For other older adults, home alone might be that there are extended period of time when they're home alone. Maybe they're living with an adult child who's gone to work all day, or a spouse who's still working. So they're home alone, but they're still living with somebody at the end of the day. Perhaps they're living with a spouse who is sick and is not currently in the home, but will hopefully return to the home. Or perhaps their family is very much involved in their care, but the family's on vacation. Again, in that moment, that person is home alone, but not for their entirety of their lifespan in that house. And lastly, there are people who actually do live with others, but the people with whom they live aren't able to provide the support or assistance that they need. And thus, while they are technically living with other people, they have no support or assistance in the home for them. Next slide, please. So why are more and more older adults aging alone? It's helpful to think about them in all different ways. Sometimes older adults prefer this. They've always lived in their own home. They have no desire to move. Perhaps they've lived with a spouse who has passed on, or with older children who have moved out, but they've chosen to age alone in their own home. It's also important to think about what's happened to family dynamics. There are more and more families who are living through divorce. And moreover, there are people who are just simply living longer and have outlived their spouse by a considerable number of years. Some older adults may be living alone due to a health concern, or perhaps a substance use issue. Maybe they're really disconnected because of transportation. They would like to be socially engaged, but they have no way to be engaged. And for many, and for some others, maybe they've just simply been left behind by technology, that for all of the ways that we've tried to bring community into people's homes, they have no way to access it. Next slide, please. So before we delve into the troubles and the challenges of older adults aging alone with dementia, let's think for a moment about how it could actually be advantageous for somebody who is starting to lose their cognition to live in their own home. Well, for one, familiarity makes it easier for them. They know where their things are for the most part in their own home. They know how to get from room to room. The things of pieces and parts of daily living aren't confusing to them because they know their home. And therefore, they're able to maintain those same routines in that home that they always have. And that becomes very stabilizing for them and is a great assistance as they start to lose cognition. Moreover, they've established daily routines in that house that give them a sense of purpose. And with that purpose becomes a counterbalance to the challenges of losing memory. So it gives them that sense of, I have something meaningful to do. And maybe it's as simple as, I need to get up today and water my plants. My plants need me. That in and of itself gives the older adult a sense of purpose and meaning to their days, and those routines are very helpful. And then it's helpful to think about, what does home mean for people? For many of us, home isn't necessarily just a place, but it's an emotion, it's a feeling. And when you ask older adults, what does home mean to you? Many of them will say, home is my sign of independence. Home is where I feel competent. And by contrast, moving becomes an admission of frailty, of loneliness, and of illness. And so staying in that home takes on a huge importance for their overall mental well-being. Next slide, please. So as we think about living alone, and we've talked a little bit, about what could be a benefit of that, let's think a little bit about, what are the risks of living alone with dementia. So if we look on the left-hand slide, we look at some of the tales of daily living or other things that are happening to that person that can be impacted by dementia. Perhaps the person isn't great about remembering to bathe or to change their clothes every day. Perhaps the home isn't really picked up or clean, which means that there are more fall risks in the home because they're tripping over the things that they've left on the floor. Maybe they aren't able to maintain their nutrition. Maybe they've lost their interest in eating. Maybe they've forgotten whether or not they've eaten a meal. And then think about how that then plays off with medications, because medications often need to be taken with food. And so if somebody's not maintaining their nutrition, even if they're remembering to take their medication, Are they taking them in the right amount? And are they taking them with the food that will help their bodies to process them? It also raises big issues around home safety, what happens with other health conditions they might be facing, and what money management also becomes a huge issue for people living alone with dementia. In fact, one of the first signs that someone might be suffering from memory loss is an inability to manage numbers and to add and subtract the way they used to. So imagine if you've lost your ability to add and subtract in a confident way, what happens to your ability to manage your finances? And so as you can see on the right-hand side, there are a lot of resulting complications that can come from somebody who's trying desperately to navigate living alone. Next slide, please. So we've talked about living alone, but there's something else that's actually associated with that, and that's this idea of loneliness and social isolation. The interesting thing about this is that before COVID, when social workers, and maybe many of you have experienced this as well, but as social workers talked about social isolation, people kind of looked at us strangely, like, well, I don't really know what that is. That doesn't really sound like anything that has much import or meaning. But now, when so many of us have experienced social isolation ourselves, this whole conversation has taken on a whole new meaning, and therefore so have attempts to address it and to find solutions for it. I think it's important to start this part of the conversation, though, with an understanding of the differences between loneliness and social isolation, because oftentimes they're used interchangeably. So loneliness is the subjective feeling of being alone, regardless of how much social contact you have. So perhaps you've experienced this yourself, that idea of being lonely in a crowd, or perhaps being lonely in a marriage. You're with somebody, you're not really socially disconnected, but you're lonely. You're not feeling emotionally connected, maybe just in that moment, to the people with whom you are. Social isolation, on the other hand, is an objective measurement of how connected somebody is to their community. So if somebody is socially isolated, it means that they really have no connection to other people or to other organizations in the community that engage them in any way. The numbers are pretty astounding. 33 to 43% of older Americans report being lonely or always lonely. And the number of older adults who report feeling isolated has doubled since 2018. And certainly COVID has played a big part in that. Next slide, please. So social isolation now has been declared a public health crisis. And why, you might wonder? Well, social isolation that has been found puts older adults at a higher risk for all sorts of comorbid diseases, from heart disease. It impacts their immune system, it impacts their memory, and oftentimes has been associated with early death. The other thing it does is that we've seen strong correlations between social isolation and stress, depression, and suicide. It's also associated with a rise in unhealthy habits. Maybe it's around eating or drinking, or maybe it's around physical movement or actually just using their brains in ways that engage them and keep their brain healthy. The other thing about social isolation that has been talked about less is that it's been correlated with an increase in elder abuse. Older adults who are socially isolated are less likely to report if they've been abused, particularly financially, by somebody else. And because they're isolated, nobody's around to see what's really going on. And it also has been correlated with an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. Next slide, please. So what have we learned about social isolation from the pandemic? I think one of the most important things we've learned is that technology is not a universal solution for social isolation. So many of the programs that have been put out today to address social isolation in older adults in light of the pandemic rely on technology. But the challenge really is around access. Some communities don't have the broadband for older adults to engage via technology. Some older adults just have no desire to learn something new, and therefore, even if the technology is offered to them, they don't have the capacity or the desire to use it. And therefore, assuming that technology is going to save us leaves a lot of gaps in the services that we provide. Moreover, we've learned that social isolation is going to have long-lasting ramifications. Yes, things are beginning to open up now, but how are people really going to come back? What are going to be the traumatic wounds from having spent so much time alone, removed from any type of social engagement? Moreover, a lot of people living with social isolation start to experience depression, and then depression impedes the ability for them to engage in alternative approaches. So depression might be that voice saying, I just don't feel like eating today. I don't feel like taking my medications, even though I know that would make me feel better. I don't feel like moving. I don't feel like doing that puzzle or reading my book. And therefore, our ways of engaging with people who are now not only socially isolated, but living with depression makes it all the more confusing. I think another important lesson we've learned is that nobody can force another person to change or to try something new. And I know this must sound really basic, but I think there's so much effort around, well, we'll just get grandma to do this. We'll just get my mom to try this new technology. It's going to give her so many opportunities. And then we get really frustrated because we can't get mom to engage with it, or we can't get grandma to engage with it. And the reality is we can't force anybody to change their ways. And as a result, I think we continue to struggle to find relevant ways to reach the isolated older adults living in our communities. Next slide, please. So this leads us to the conversation around, we've talked a little bit about dementia. We've talked about social isolation. What happens when they intersect? Can older adults with dementia live alone? And are there any ways that we can serve them? Or is it really so bleak? Next slide, please. So I think as we think about it, we want to keep in mind 3 areas of concern that we want to consider when we're looking at older adults living with dementia. One is their capacity to care for themselves. What impact has their memory loss had on their ability to care for themselves? Their lack of insight into their own limitations, the inability to ask for help, and self-neglect. All big areas for us to think about for somebody living alone. The second thing is, how are they able to navigate social situations? And this is really where we see the connection with elder abuse. We have found that older adults with dementia tend to become really trusting of other people. And as a result, they become very vulnerable to scams and exploitation. They're no longer really able to figure out social cues. And without that ability to navigate that social world, and without anybody else there to help them with that, they tend to be taken advantage of in pretty dramatic ways. And the third thing is, are they really able to live in the community? As their memory starts to decline, people tend to become fearful of unfamiliar places. What if I go there and I don't know how to get home? What if I get there and I don't know what to do when I get there? And so they tend to withdraw into their homes, which reinforces that sense of being socially isolated. Next slide, please. I think it's also important as we have this conversation to remember the stigma that still exists in our communities today around the diagnosis of dementia and how that plays into this whole picture, particularly for older adults who are living alone. For many of them, they want to keep this diagnosis hidden for as long as possible. They don't want people to know. Maybe they're embarrassed by it. They're embarrassed by what they don't remember or what they're no longer able to do. They're worried that someone might force them to leave their home. So they hide. And what that means for us as community service providers is that they're largely invisible to us until they're in crisis. And so that ability to intervene early, to put plans in place, escapes us because they're hiding from sight. Nextly, that disconnection means that they often go undiagnosed, or there's a delayed recognition that anything is going on. And again, as before, because they're undiagnosed, we aren't able to put the supports and programming in place to take care of them. Thirdly, they tend to be isolated from formal support, understandably, and they're unlikely to seek the help that they need. Again, lacking that insight of what's really happening and without anybody to say to them, I'm concerned about you, I'm worried about the changes that I'm seeing, they don't tend to connect outside. And when they do, it's still not a great solution for them because so often our system focuses on older adults whose family members are their caregivers, and the programs help the caregivers take care of that older adult, but not so much focused on that older adult who's living alone and doesn't have a family caregiver in place. And that isolation, again, impacts their desire to manage daily activities. That's, again, where that depression piece fits in. And so around and around they go. Next slide, please. So what can we do? Well, first of all, how do we know if somebody living in our community might be living with these types of cognitive changes, living with dementia? Sometimes the changes are really subtle, and sometimes it's an array of little things rather than any one big thing that makes us realize, you know what, I think we need to look into this more. And as we go through this journey of understanding, how do we support people who are living alone? I think the most important thing for us to do is to keep safety front and center for them. Next slide, please. So here are some of the main changes as you think about, well, how would I know if somebody in my community is suffering from memory loss? So there's some main changes we can look at. Number one would be emotional changes. Do they tend to become, are they more apathetic than normal? Are they more negative? Or perhaps more suspicious? Or maybe do you think they might even be more fearful than they normally would be? Think about how they communicate. That's another way of starting to discern whether or not there's something going on. Did they used to send cards, write letters, and suddenly you don't hear from them anymore? Has their handwriting changed? Is it more sloppy? Is it harder to understand what the person is trying to say? Or are they searching for words or perhaps using the wrong words? Another thing to think about is medication and meals. Have you had a sense that they may not be taking their medications as prescribed? Or have they stopped eating correctly? Have they gained or lost a lot of weight? Again, this might be a sign that something's happening with them in terms of their cognition. And lastly, you might want to look at their behaviors. Do they repeat themselves over and over in the same conversation? Are conversations becoming increasingly vague? Or do they tend to ramble and go on and on about the same thing? What's happened with hygiene? Are they remembering to take a bath, to change their clothes? Are they living with spoiled food in the house, which would be a behavior they never would have before? So it's looking for the little signs and symptoms and the clues along the way that can give us a sense that something's happening in the life of that older adult who's living alone. Next slide, please. As we go through this, the conversations always come back to capacity. Does the person have the capacity to live alone? So let's just quickly remind ourselves what capacity involves. So capacity involves several things. It's about the ability to understand information around a decision that you're going to be making. It's not only about understanding the information, but understanding the importance of the information relative to your own situation. And then it's about the ability to weigh options that you have based on the information that you've been given. And then lastly, the ability to express your choice or your preference based on the information you've been provided. The important thing to remember is that just because somebody is diagnosed with dementia, it does not end their legal rights to make decisions. And in fact, all of us have a right to make decisions on our own behalf until that right has been taken away by a court of law. So for many people, we might think that they lack capacity, but that doesn't mean that they lack the right to make a decision, which makes this all very complicated. Next slide, please. So we've talked in this sort of a negative way, well, they can't do this and we can't do that, but what are ways for people to live in our communities in ways that they can maintain some level of independence in a way that's safe and supported? And I think as we talk about this idea around maintaining independence, it's helpful to think about it within three buckets: the bucket of safety, the bucket of technology, and the bucket of support. Next slide, please. So first, let's think about what does safety in the home mean. I think it's helpful to think about safety in the home through the lens of access. So access looks like all different things. It might mean, can that older person get things out of the cupboard? Are they able to get into the house if they're carrying a bag of groceries without hurting themselves? Are the bathrooms safe? Are there grab bars in the bathroom? Are they able to navigate the stairs? Can they get to the place where they do their laundry? These are all questions around access in the home that are important as we think about an older adult living with memory loss by themselves. Another thing we wanted to think about is, are there modifications that can be made to the home that could make that home safer for the older adult? Perhaps it's about putting in extra handrails or grab bars or ramps leading up to the home. Another way to address safety in the home is to develop a routine for daily household tasks, to really spell out and remind an older adult in very clear ways around cleaning the apartment, around doing grocery shopping, around doing errands. And if it's clearly spelled out, oftentimes older adults who are in the earlier stages of diagnosis are able to follow that daily routine. We also want to make sure that older adults can reach out for help. So asking them, if something happened, if there was a fire in your house, if you felt unsafe, who would you call? Making sure they still remember that they can dial 911. Other things we can do in the home are to put in things like automatic turnoffs, where appliances stay on for a certain amount of time and then they automatically turn off, because oftentimes older adults might forget that they're cooking and leave food in the oven. And lastly, in order to really create a good plan for safety in the home, it's important to try to find a professional caregiver, somebody who's going to be coming into that home on a regular basis to make sure that that older adult is living safely, has what he or she needs, and is able to manage alone. Next slide, please. Another important piece, though, as we think about safety in the home is, how do we increase access to care? For people who have been living alone and pride themselves on living alone, how do they start to accept help from somebody on the outside without seeing it through the eyes of being judged or having failed? And so really it's around, how do we as community programs and support services build trust based on the values and preferences for care that that older adult has? And that's why it's makes it so much easier if we can start working with people earlier on, when they're still really able to express their preferences for their own care. Again, identifying their needs by asking questions, staying person-centered in all that we do, and having a willingness to find creative solutions to the problems that they face. Another important piece about maintaining safety in the home and a real caring network is to make sure that is to do what we can to coordinate care between medical and social service providers, making sure that we work as much as possible seamlessly together to best support these older adults. And again, we want to make sure we maintain contact with them. And I like to say that we practice persistence, that if we're struggling to connect with them, what do we do to continually try to engage with them? Next slide, please. So for many of you, assistive technology is an important piece of the work that you do. And it's interesting to think about the role of technology in the space around older adults living alone with dementia. I think it's important to understand that technology in this space can help manage, but does not eliminate the risk of people living alone, and it cannot solve all of their problems. For so many people, particularly family members of older adults living alone, the thought is, well, there must be an app for that. And the reality is, unfortunately, that in this space of older adults, there's lots of apps, but there's not always an app to manage the needs that they have. So it's important to understand or to identify, what is the problem that you want the technology to solve? There are lots and lots of technologies out there, but trying to figure out which one would be most helpful needs to start with, what is the problem we're trying to solve for? And then really to understand the technology's capabilities, limitations, practicality, and privacy issues. So for instance, oftentimes a solution is to say, well, you know what, my older adult is socially isolated, living alone. I'm going to buy them a brand new iPad, and this is going to be the solution. They just have to push this button here, they push that there. It's going to be so easy for them to use. But we lose sight of the fact that older adult may never have used technology in their life. They are now suffering from cognitive impairment, and the ability to learn something new and to remember it so that they don't have to ask you over and over how to use it becomes much more limited. And so really thinking about this is a technology, it's a solution for some, but is it practical for the problem I'm trying to solve for with the person I'm trying to help? Next slide, please. It's also really important as we think about technology solutions to think about the limitations of technology. For many of our older adults living in our communities, they may not have the Wi-Fi capability in their home to even use the internet or to even use the technology that you want to bring in. They may not remember or even agree to wear a device that would enable us to track their movement or even just to track whether or not they've fallen. Oftentimes, someone needs to manage the device in the home, and the person with dementia might not always have comfort using that technology. So to give you a good example, I remember working with a woman. She was in the earlier stages of dementia, and she was having a hard time remembering to take her medication. Her family lived out of state, and they decided that the perfect solution was to have an automated pill dispenser put into her home, and the dispenser would drop out the pills she needed to take at the exact time of day, and if she didn't take it in that time, the machine literally just sucked the pills back into it, and the family would have an understanding of how she was taking her medications, was she taking them enough, etc. Well, it sounded like a great solution, except the first time that this machine went off and it started talking to her in her daughter's voice, because that's the way they had programmed it, this poor woman fell apart. She couldn't understand how she could hear her daughter in the house. She couldn't find her daughter anywhere. Suddenly there were these pills that had dropped out of this random machine in her home. She went to get them, but she wasn't fast enough. The pills were sucked back into the machine. And we found her literally in a ball on the floor sobbing because this technology that was supposed to help her had so disturbed her that she just didn't know and had a very hard time recovering from it. So again, it's a great device if it works for the person with whom you're working. But it's so important to understand that not everybody is going to be comfortable using the technology. The last thing to point out around technology is that oftentimes, particularly with technology that allows you to sort of look in on an older adult in their home, it tends to discourage families from actually visiting. They say, well, I've got my eye on mom or dad. I know what's going on. And so that person actually becomes even more socially isolated by the technology that's there to help the situation. Next slide, please. So again, this just goes to that place of the earlier we try to help people who don't have an established support system, the less complicated it will be to provide assistance. We'll be able to establish more rapport with them. We'll be able to understand their needs, and we'll also be able to understand what they're capable of and where they need support. And this makes it challenging if people are living alone and are isolated and withdrawn. How do we even connect with them? Next slide, please. So as we think about ways that we can help, I think it's important to think about what help is actually helpful. And this is really where that support piece comes in. So older adults have told us that these are some of the main things that they could use help with. And again, as that automated medication aid will tell you, it depends on the person. But a lot of it centers around transportation, personal care, safety, money, and getting to doctor's appointments. Next slide, please. So if that's the case, and we really want to support older adults who are living on their own and perhaps socially isolated, what can we do? One of the most effective things we can do is to build a care team comprised of people from all different avenues of life who can really be there to help that person and develop basically a network for them of advisors who can help them as the dementia progresses. One of the challenges, of course, for that care team is how do we balance that older adults' need for freedom, their need to be autonomous, and the risk that they take on by living alone? How do we capitalize on the benefits of a collaborative care model where we have medical professionals and social professionals working together? One of the most important things we need to do as we engage with people living alone with dementia is work with them as best as we can to prepare for their future care needs. What are their preferences? What are their finances? And how are we going to come up with a plan for them so that as their memory loss continues, as they continue to struggle more, we know who's going to plug in, how and why and when. And we can do this really by building on the strengths of that older adult. Again, encouraging them to maintain those daily routines, focusing on what they've been interested in for a long time. What are their old hobbies that they were interested in that takes them to a place where they still feel confident about what they're doing? And then how do we try to encourage them to engage in things outside of themselves? Perhaps to join a support group, senior center, or an adult day program where they'll find peers who are going through similar struggles, but it gives them that social connection that can help them. Next slide, please. I think it's also always important to remember that our older adults living alone also have a role in all of this, that there are things they can do to make this easier for themselves. One of them is really to simplify the tasks of daily living. Think about, what do I have to do for myself? And this is really where, a service providers coming in can help with these conversations. What are those ways that we can make it simpler? Things that they can do for themselves, things that they can get from the outside. Does Mrs. Jones really need to continue to cook dinner for herself every night? Is that just too much? Is remembering to turn the stove on enough a real risk for Miss Jones? Would it be better to have her get a home delivered meal or some other type of food delivery service? Are there ways that she can engage with transportation to get where she needs to go? Maybe she doesn't need to be driving herself there anymore. Also, finding ways to increase safety in the home, reminding the older adult to carry an ID with them wherever they go, to think about, what are the fall hazards in that house that I could remove, again with the sense that it will enable that older adult to stay there longer if the home is safe for them. Helping them to think through, how do you want to prepare for the future? Do you have legal advisors that you trust, financial advisors that you trust? And how can I help you best to understand your options for care? And then lastly, encouraging our older adults to embrace healthy habits, to be mindful of exercise, nutrition, sleep, and socialization. Next slide, please. Again, this is never easy, particularly with this isolated population. They may lack the diagnosis, they aren't able to access care, and the healthcare system isn't always that flexible for their needs. Imagine the number of buttons that we need to push on our phones when we call to make a doctor's appointment. Push 1 for this, push 2 for that, push 7 for this. If you are struggling with cognitive impairment, there is no way you're going to be able to navigate the maze of the phone system to be able to access the doctor. So again, understanding where are the problems for the individual and where are the problems on the service side that makes it hard for our older adults to access help. Next slide, please. So are there solutions? And thankfully, yes, there are. So now I would like to end with just a quick review of 2 different types of solutions that are available to older adults who are socially isolated and aging in the community with dementia. One of them is a community-based response, and the other is one that really works directly with that older adult. Next slide, please. So this is sort of a grounding in how challenging this is, and a reminder to all of us that we really need to make sure that that our community and our social services are what we would call dementia capable. Are they able to respond to the needs of people living with dementia, and particularly those who don't have anyone to assist them along the way? Next slide, please. So what might dementia care for isolated older adults look like? Well, we want to make sure we educate them and educate ourselves and those around us to have a better understanding of what dementia really means and what it looks like and how we can respond to it. We want to make sure that everybody on this care team understands all the available treatment options that might be out there. We want to understand how to manage other coexisting conditions and to coordinate care at all levels. We want to make sure that that older adult has meaningful, purposeful activities in their life and that they have a way of connecting with others living with dementia. Next slide, please. And so we get to our community-based solution, which is known as Dementia Friends. Dementia Friends is actually a national movement, and really it's an international movement. It began in England and has come to this country and is known as Dementia Friendly America. And it is truly an effort to get communities, organizations, and individuals working together to support people living with dementia and their caregivers. Next slide, please. So a dementia-inclusive community is a community in which all of the organizations and the people understand the disease and respect people living with it and understand how we can best support options for fostering quality of life. So what the Dementia Friends movement does is literally goes into communities and educates people that are working in the banks, people that are working in the grocery stores, people that may be working in the hair salons, any place where a person living with dementia might go, and helps them to understand what the disease looks like, how people with it respond, so that if somebody with dementia who's living alone goes to the grocery store, that grocery store cashier is more sensitive to the needs of that person, so that the people standing in line behind that person are more respectful and responsive to the needs of that person, so that we come together as communities to support our older loved ones living with the diagnosis. And so I will tell you that here in Cleveland, Cleveland Heights is now becoming a dementia-friendly community, and their efforts throughout the city of Cleveland to educate service providers, organizations, what have you, on becoming dementia friends and to really becoming champions of the Dementia Friends movement so that our communities become more comfortable for our older adults to live in. Next slide, please. And again, I know this slide is a little bit small, but again, it's about how do we focus on the community impact? How do we connect with, engage our legal and financial services, our faith-based communities, our businesses and employers, our healthcare providers, our memory loss services, to all come together to support the people, again, living in our community with dementia. Next slide, please. The Dementia Friends movement has 5 key messages. Dementia is not a natural part of aging. It's not just about losing your memory, and that you can live well with dementia, and reminding all of us that there's far more to the person than just their diagnosis. Next slide, please. So if that's a community-based solution, are there any programs out there that can help that person living alone with dementia? Let's say we've identified someone who really could use some support and is willing to talk to somebody. So I want to talk to you briefly today about the program of Benjamin Rose Institute on Aging, which is known as WeCare Because You Do. So WeCare Because You Do is a program that actually was developed by Benjamin Rose about 25 years ago under the name of BRI Care Consultation. And about 2 years ago, Benjamin Rose decided to deliver the program on its own and changed the name of our own delivery site, so to speak, to WeCare. What does WeCare do? In a nutshell, WeCare is about 4 things. It's about making sure that people have access to good information, that they understand, that they get information on their diagnosis, they get support in helping to connect with services, that they get support on how to talk to their doctor. And it also helps providers and people who are serving in that caregiver role on strategies for working with that older adult living alone. It also helps that older adult to connect to community-based services and to give them small, simple action steps that they can do to help impact their own situation. And oftentimes, one of the things that WeCare does is to work with people who are truly living alone and to help identify somebody who can serve in that role of a caregiver so that person isn't totally isolated. And really, it addresses all the issues older adults care about most: long-term care planning, financial and legal concerns, housing options, etc. The program has always been delivered via telephone and email, so this is not a COVID pivot for us. And we find it's an effective way to reach people who are truly socially isolated. Next slide, please. So again, just kind of a review. What do we do? What does WeCare do best? Provide older adults with one number to call for assistance. That older adult who's living with memory challenges doesn't probably have the capacity to remember all the different phone numbers for all the different services of help that they need in the home. We're saying to them, here's one number to call, will help you coordinate the rest. It helps older adults get the information they need to make important decisions. Again, if they have capacity around decisions, to make sure they understand the decisions that they're being asked to make. We help them to access and navigate community resources and find ways to engage each person's support network and to create one if none exist. Next slide, please. So how do we get there? So WeCare looks actually at 35 areas of life: financial, mental, relationship, and financial health that are impacted by chronic health, and then creates a safety net of services to minimize the gaps in care. Again, it's around that care coordination for families. We do it by fostering engagement with the people with whom we're working. So it's not about a one-time referral call, but it's about the relationship that develops between the care consultant and the family, or with that older adult who is living alone. And then it's all about how do we support family preferences through coaching and mentoring. Next slide, please. So just in summary, because I know this is, I've talked for a while, but I want to just review what we've discussed today. Number one, social isolation is a critical public health concern. Older adults living with dementia are particularly susceptible to social isolation and then all of the complications that come from it. It is possible to live alone with dementia as long as there are supports in place and plans to address future care needs. Dementia Friends is a program that supports those living with dementia by increasing the awareness of the community around dementia and what the community can do to make a difference. And programs like WeCare provide access to and assistance with navigating community resources directly for that person who is aging alone. Last slide, please. So this is my contact information if you have any questions, but I would like now, first of all, to thank you for your time today and to open it up to any questions.
All right, Lisa, thank you so much for that very informative explanation on this topic. We do have a few questions. The first question is, what can you do when a person chooses to be socially isolated if they complain of feeling depressed?
You know, it's such a tough question, and it really gets back to that piece around people maintaining the right to make decisions for themselves, even if we know they're not good decisions. And so I think the only thing we can do is continue to talk with them, to continue to offer them options, and to let them know that they have a voice in choosing something different. And I think the more they recognize that they have a choice, perhaps the easier it becomes. I think also it's helpful to think about, what did that person used to like to do? And going back to some of those hobbies or whatnot that they enjoyed in the past, and seeing if you can't re-engage them in those activities. But it is a huge challenge.
Yes, I agree. The next question, are there any programs that are currently offered by WeCare that work with socially isolated individuals inside of their homes?
Yes, so WeCare actually is delivered. It is completely virtual, and it is a care coaching or care coordination model as opposed to being a case management model. So we do work with older adults living alone in their own homes all the time. And the nice thing about it is that we have recently received grant funding. So we are able to deliver WeCare at no cost to either the older adult living alone and or the family caregiver living in Cuyahoga, Lake, Geauga, Lorain, and Medina counties. So it makes the program really accessible. And it also makes us a great partner with some of the organizations with whom some of you may be working, because we can be an add-on service at no cost to the families.
That's awesome. We have another question. It just says, if we do not need CEUs, will we still be able to get a general certificate of attendance? Yes. So if you would like a certificate of attendance that's outside of the CEU certification, you can just email me. After this is over, you will get like a follow-up email. So you can just shoot me a message back, and I can make sure that you get that certification or the certificate of attendance, okay? Well, Lisa, I want to thank you again for taking some time out to educate us on this topic. with COVID happening and everything else that happened this past year. I mean, this topic has always been an issue, but of course, we've seen increased, numbers of socially isolated individuals that may have dementia. So everything that you told us today was really helpful on some ways that we can kind of help or point people in the right direction to get help. So I want to thank you again. And if anybody has any questions for Lisa, please feel free to email her. Her information is up. There's her telephone number. And everyone, please stay safe. And I look forward to seeing a lot of you on our next webinar. Lisa, did you have anything left that you wanted to say before we end?
No, just thank you so much to everyone. I greatly appreciate it, and don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of help.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you, and everyone enjoy your Monday.
Bye-bye. Thank you.